Hi students, welcome back, and today we are going to get into chapter 2 of your textbook. This is the lecture where we're really going to go in depth about Spanish California. So let's go ahead and get started with our lecture questions. Okay, so as you can see by the number of lecture questions that we have here, this PowerPoint is significantly longer than the last two lectures we did. This is really sort of two lectures in one PowerPoint. So lecture question number 1 is how and why do the Spanish colonize Alta California? And remember, when we say Alta California, we're talking about the upper part of California as compared to Baja California. We don't typically think of California as Alta California anymore because California is just part of the United States and Baja California is part of Mexico. But back then there was actually a distinction made between Alta California and Baja California. So how and why do the Spanish colonize Alta California is our first lecture question. Number 2, who were some of the early explorers to Alta California? And remember that Baja California was actually explored and colonized earlier than Alta California. Number 3, what was Spanish colonial culture like in California? Once they established colonies in California, what was the culture like? How did it develop? And then finally, number 4, what was the economy of early California like? And how was it connected to the greater Pacific economy? So you can't really understand California and early colonization in California without really understanding how it was connected to greater and broader Pacific cultures. Again, one of my favorite things about the history of the West is its diversity. And of course, the trading networks and all of the different interactions between different cultures that took place in California really lends to its diversity. So here are the key terms for this lecture. As you can see, there are quite a few. So I will go ahead and pause here for a minute. But again, remember key terms, those are the guideposts for the lecture. You want to make sure that for each of these key terms, you are going to know the definition of the key term and also why is it important? Why is it important in terms of the broader context of California history? So how does it fit into the bigger puzzle, right? So those are the two things you want to really focus on with these key terms. Okay, so just to provide some context and kind of give just a basic introduction to this, the first thing to recognize is that 100 years before the English began their colonization project in places like Jamestown, Virginia, and Plymouth, Massachusetts, the Spanish had already begun to colonize the Americas. And of course, it begins with the voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492, when he sailed the ocean blue and then claimed areas of land in the Caribbean and also in the northern parts of South America for the Spanish crown. The primary outposts in Columbus's time of Spanish settlement were the island of Cuba and also the island of Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And so that was true all the way until the conquest of Hernan Cortez in what is now present-day Mexico. And that happens in 1519. And that's when the headquarters of New Spain moves to Mexico City. So after the conquest of Cortez, Mexico becomes New Spain. And the mestizo culture will begin to develop. And this is a mixture of both Spanish and indigenous peoples and their descendants. Areas outside of central Mexico and what is now Mexico City are very slow to develop. So the colonization project, especially in North America, is going to be very slow. And eventually what's going to lead to the Spanish making the decision to really be a lot more aggressive about colonizing these northern provinces will be competition with other countries, as we're going to start to see other countries wanting to claim land in North America. Countries like England, of course, but also Russia, and also in some cases France, but that happens more on the East Coast and in Canada. So let's begin by talking about the conquest of Hernan Cortez. So Hernan Cortez was born in Medellin, Spain. He was the son of a minor noble family, and he, like many other young Spanish men during this time period, decided that he was going to try to find his fortune in the New World. So as a young man, 19 years old, he sets sail for the New World, and he ends up in Cuba, where he finds himself being a very capable leader and eventually becomes the mayor of Santiago, Cuba. And it's from this position as mayor in Santiago that he is able to petition the governor of Cuba, the Spanish governor of Cuba, to allow him to carry out this expedition along the coast of Mexico. He had already heard of other explorers that had gone up and down the eastern coast of Mexico, along the Gulf of Mexico, exploring the coastlines. And one of the things that these early explorers noted was the fact that not only was the place very densely populated, but the people there spoke of this inland empire, this empire of gold, right? And of course, they were referring to the Aztec kingdom. And in this particular time, the Aztec kingdom was ruled by King Montezuma II. And so Cortez is fascinated by this. And, you know, one of the primary purposes of many of these conquistadors, which is the name given to these early explorers for Spain, is wanting to find riches, right? And of course, it would have brought them much prosperity to find riches for the crown, but there's also an element of personal gain involved in this. So Cortez is able to convince the governor of Cuba, hey, I've got this idea. I know that it's going to work. I really think that we need to lead an expedition into this, kingdom to figure out what's going on. And so he is given 11 ships, 550 men, 16 horses, and 10 cannons to carry out this expedition to the shores of present-day Mexico. And this is in 1519. When he lands on the shores of what is now modern-day Veracruz, he realizes that this empire that exists in inland and this fabled city of Tenochtitlan is feared in many cases by a lot of the local tribes, especially the tribes along the coast, because this powerful kingdom would on an annual basis come out to these neighboring tribes and demand that they pay tribute, essentially a form of taxes. And in many cases, these taxes were paid with human beings, right? They would ask for human beings. Now, they might have been asking for these human beings to go and work in the city and help build the mighty pyramids and all of this, so essentially like a slave labor force. But they also practice human sacrifice. And so a lot of these surrounding tribal communities that were around the Mexica/Aztec Empire, they started to resent the rulership of Montezuma II. And so Cortez really picks up on this. And he then is given a young woman, as kind of like a gift or like a guide. She was able to translate and work as a guide and an interpreter for him. And her name is Doña Marina. She's also known as Malinche, which is actually her indigenous name. So once he has Dona Maria by her side, and he's got all of these men and horses and weapons and things like that, he decides to carry out this expedition inland. And they essentially take over the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, and they describe the wonders of this city as being magnificent, as being similar in beauty to the most beautiful cities in Spain. And they kind of just occupy the city, right, for a good couple of years. And then there are some political instabilities that take place. Eventually, Montezuma is killed, and the Spanish will conquer the Aztec kingdom completely by 1521. And at that time, Hernan Cortez moves in, and he is claimed, governor of this new province, and they're calling it New Spain. So this is when Tenochtitlan's name is changed from the indigenous name to the modern name of Mexico City. So here we have a map of Cortez's expeditions. Again, beginning in 1519, here is the expedition leaving from Santiago, moving over along the Yucatan Peninsula, all the way to Veracruz, where again, he's able to gather some native allies, which become really critical in the eventual overthrow of the Aztec kingdom. They travel overland to Tenochtitlan, where, as I said, they essentially occupy the city for 2 years until eventually the city falls to the Spanish. It's renamed Mexico City. At that time, Cortez will take leadership of this area, which is then renamed New Spain. And you can also see that there are further expeditions. 1535, Cortez travels out here to what is now the Gulf of California. He sees this Baja Peninsula of Baja California, and he says, aha, I know just what to name this land. I will name it California after Queen Calafia, in that very famous and popular Spanish novel of the day. And then eventually he travels back to Mexico City and carries out more expeditions also down here to what is now present day Guatemala. So he's really carrying out many expeditions in this area, mapping this area for the Spanish, but also claiming it for the Spanish crown. So, from the headquarters of New Spain, the Spanish want to continue their explorations, and this explorer who had actually been part of Cortez's expedition to Tenochtitlan and other expeditions that he was on, a man by the name of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, is chosen by the Spanish viceroy, which is essentially like the governor, the big governor, kind of like the president, basically, of the colony in New Spain, Viceroy Mendoza. He's chosen in 1542 to take an expedition up the Pacific coast of Baja California to find the legendary Strait of Anin. Now, the Strait of Anin was like what we would call in English the Northwest Passage, right? It was supposed to be this very quick waterway that could basically link the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean, making trade between Europe and Asia a lot quicker and efficient, right? So he is tasked with doing this. There are 3 different vessels that are put under his command. And he travels up the coast of Baja, and then eventually in 1542, he reaches the bay of what he names San Miguel, what we now call San Diego, and it was renamed later by later explorers. in September of 1542. And he notes the landscape, he notes the local native people, the Kumeyaay native people. And in fact, this week you're going to be reading a document that talks about his first impressions of the Kumeyaay people and sort of what they did, what their interaction was like. That's a primary source document from the Cabrillo expedition. Okay, and then he continues on, and he continues on up the coast of Alta California. He notes the Monterey Bay, but doesn't do a whole lot of significant exploration in that region, but then moves on to past the San Francisco Bay up to where he's going to, the expedition is going to reach some very sort of choppy waters and some storms, and they're essentially forced to turn around somewhere around Northern California. We're not exactly sure where. By this time in the expedition, Cabrillo had actually fallen and broken his arm early in the expedition when they were traveling up the coast, and his arm becomes infected with gangrene. And eventually this will lead to his death in January of 1543. And his body was buried, according to the expedition, on one of the Channel Islands. And there still is a lot of controversy over to exactly where this body was buried and located. There was a headstone that was actually found on one of the more remote uninhabited Channel Islands back in the 1990s that they think could possibly be Cabrillo's headstone, but it has never definitively been proven. But essentially, Cabrillo's exploration of Alta California most significantly establishes Spain's claim to Alta California. So every time these early explorers, these conquistadors, went out to these new lands, they were required by law to say the requirimiento, which was essentially this proclamation that this particular land was being claimed for the crown, for the Spanish crown. And in terms of the Spanish mentality, this then legitimately made that land part of Spain. So not only does his exploration basically document the region, say, yeah, there are some navigable ports and some sheltered bays and things like that, but also there are lots of native people, which of course were noted extensively throughout his journal, and finally that he had made this claim on the territory for Spain. Okay, so after this early expedition of Alta California, not a whole lot is going to go on in terms of the California coast. It won't be until the Manilla Galleon trade is going to be established. And this really takes off after 1571, when the Spanish crossed the Pacific Ocean and essentially claim Manila and the Philippines for the Spanish crown. So the Philippines becomes an extension of the Spanish colonies in the Americas in 1571. There was a very good reason for this, and that's that the Spanish were very successfully mining precious metals in the Americas. One of the biggest mines, silver mines, was in Zacatecas, Mexico, and also in Potosi, which is in modern-day Bolivia. These were two massive, massive silver mines. And significantly, right around this same time that the Spanish were able to find and process this silver, the Chinese switched their currency from a paper currency to a silver currency. And they also made a law in China that you had to pay all of your taxes and all business transactions had to be done in silver. So the Chinese were in need of silver. Alternately, the Europeans wanted Chinese goods. So this situation worked out very well for the Spanish. The only problem for them is that they needed a Pacific trading outpost that was in close proximity to Asia. So that was their motivation in colonizing the Philippines in 1571. So essentially what would happen is that the Spanish would mine the silver, and then the silver would be brought across the Pacific, where the Spanish could then have an outpost at Manilla in the Philippines, and then from there they could launch trading expeditions along the Chinese coast. And they would take the silver and they would trade it for Chinese goods. What type of Chinese goods? Things like silk materials, pearls, certain types of musk, which was used as the base for a lot of perfumes in Europe, and of course spices. And this then would be brought back on these Spanish galleons across the Pacific. But the Spanish were in need of a stopping over point along this Pacific route. And this is where California is really going to come in Alta California in particular, because they wanted to make sure that they had a place that they could stop, that they could port, that they could, perhaps do repairs, etc. It was a dangerous journey to go across the Pacific. And one of the reasons why it was dangerous was because there were pirates. And those pirates were wanting those Spanish treasures, either the galleons that were loaded with silver or the galleons that were loaded with the goods. It didn't matter. Either one was very, very valuable. And the nations that were pirating the most in the Pacific during this time period would have been the English and eventually later on the Dutch, because they themselves were also competing for access to these Eastern markets. So here you can see an image, artist rendering of a Spanish galleon. They were the primary ship of commerce for the Spanish Empire between 1500 and 1800. And as you can see, they are enormous. They have these massive holes in the bottom of the ship for storing goods and also for making long journeys, because keep in mind, you also needed to feed the crews. These journeys were very difficult. Their scurvy was a very common disease that people would get. Any type of injury, as we could see what happened with Cabrillo, could be deadly. So it was a difficult journey, but it could be eventually highly rewarded, especially if you were a captain, a sea captain, a ship captain making this journey. Typically, a percentage of the goods would then be given to the sea captain as payment once the galleons had made their complete circuit around the Pacific. So here you see a map of the galleon trade routes, and you can see how they would leave from Acapulco or the surrounding areas, cross over the Pacific Ocean to Manila, and then make trips over to Macau, China, and other places also along the coast. Then they would leave the Philippines. They would make kind of this arc, as you can see. Let me get my laser pointer here. So they would make this arc across the Pacific Ocean, again, catching these currents, and then eventually, many of them would end up coming down the coast of California, again, making stopovers if necessary in this region, and then returning the goods to Mexico City. Sometimes also there would be expeditions that would go out. Lima was one of the main cities of Spanish colonies down here in Peru. And again, the silver from the Potosi mine would leave from there, and so the silver would also leave from these areas and go across to Manila as well. Then you have also this connection with Europe, right? So what would often happen is the cargo would be taken off of the ships, brought across the Panama Isthmus. There was no Panama Canal back then, and then eventually distributed. The goods would be distributed throughout the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, and then eventually back to Seville and other parts of Spain. So, I mean, it was all connected. It was an extremely global economy with lots of stopovers and lots of different exchanges. As I mentioned, this was also a very dangerous journey, particularly when you have pirates, and there were many pirates out there that were targeting Spanish galleons at the time. Pirates like Thomas Cavendish and Sir Francis Drake, who we're going to talk about later on. So the currency that was being used by the Spanish crown at this time really becomes the first global currency, and this is the Spanish piece of 8. This is a silver coin, and the reason why it's called a piece of 8 is you can see right here, it could be divided into 8 pieces. In fact, an intact piece of 8 actually represents 8 Spanish reales. Which was their currency at the time. And it was considered quite a bit of money. If you had just one piece of 8 that was intact, you were doing pretty well. As you could see, it can be broken up into 8 distinct pieces for purchasing other things. So this really becomes the first global currency. We see pieces of 8 and evidence of pieces of 8 throughout the Pacific world and throughout the Atlantic world from this time period. And by this time period, I'm talking 16th century and 17th century and even into the 18th century. So really, so for quite large amount of time in these eras of exploration, a Spanish piece of 8 was really a currency that would have been accepted by multiple countries throughout the world. So, for example, you know, we find Spanish pieces of 8 in China. We find Spanish pieces of 8 in Japan. We find Spanish pieces of 8, of course, in the Americas. We find Spanish pieces of 8 in the British colonies of North America, Jamestown and Plymouth. We find Spanish pieces of 8, of course, throughout Europe. There were even Spanish pieces of 8 in Africa as a result of the African slave trade. So we know that this is really the true first global currency, and much of it has to do, of course, with Spain's conquest of the New World early on, their establishment of these silver mines, which really become the basis of their wealth in the New World. All right, so back to talking about California and specifically Sir Francis Drake. So Sir Francis Drake was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I, and she gave him, bequeathed upon him the task of going out and essentially robbing the Spanish. Now, the Spanish and the British, of course, were enemies at this time. A lot of that had to do with religious rivalries. The Queen, of course, of England was part of the Anglican Church by this time, by the late 1500s. And of course, the Spanish were Catholic. So there was a religious aspect to this as well as a territorial aspect. And it's just sort of a competition really between empires. Eventually, of course, they fight in the famous Spanish Armada battle of 1588. So this is kind of leading up to this, but Queen Elizabeth I commissions Sir Francis Drake to not only take his ship, the Golden Hind, and circumnavigate the globe, but along the way make claims for land for the British Crown, and if possible, rob as many Spanish galleons as you can. And so that's exactly what Sir Francis Drake was doing when he stops in the San Francisco Bay in 1579 for 5 weeks to repair his ship. His ship is completely laden with treasures that he has hoisted from Spanish galleons as he had made his way up the coast of the Americas in the Pacific. And he was actually on his way on his circumnavigation of the globe, which he will accomplish in 1580. He will actually be the first single commander to circumnavigate the globe in 1580. So Drake and his men had extensive encounters with the local Indians, particularly the Miwok tribe. And he writes extensively about this in his journals. And he decides after 5 weeks, and they had relatively positive relations with the native people. They exchanged gifts. They kind of got to know each other. They hung out with each other. They had to use sign language, obviously, to communicate. But before he leaves the San Francisco Bay, he claims the land for England, calling it Nova Albion, which is essentially Latin for New England. And so he's claiming this land for the British Crown. Now, why, of course, does this matter in our story? Well, it matters in our story because it doesn't escape the attention of the British that he has indeed made this claim. Or excuse me, not the British, the Spanish. It does not escape the attention of the Spanish that he has made this claim to this land that the Spanish had already considered theirs because of Cabrillo's earlier expedition, right? So Sir Francis Drake is going to be somebody who is going to incite the Spanish to want to act, right? He was absolutely loathed by the Spanish, not just because of his claim to what they considered their land in Alta California, but of course also because he was going around robbing their ships. Okay, so because of Drake and also rivalries with the Dutch, there is going to be another official Spanish expedition that is going to be commissioned in 1602. And this time the Spanish send Sebastian Vizcaino up the Alta California coast on another 3-boat expedition. And this particular expedition was tasked with not finding the Strait of Annin, which I think that they had finally sort of given up on, but to find a good port, the best port for Spanish galleons. And again, this was sort of as a test to see whether or not this, again, could be a good place for Spanish settlement in this region. So he sails up the coast. Eventually, he will go into the Monterey Bay, which he writes extensively about in his accounts and says that it is definitely the best port in all of Alta California. And so that will become the location of the eventual capital, Spanish capital of Alta California. And it's due primarily because of Vizcaino's observations. However, despite all of this, it will still be another 165 years before the Spanish will found any kind of permanent settlement in Alta California. So although Vizcaino's mission does two things in particular that really stand out. One is he renamed San Miguel San Diego, which is, of course, the modern name for the location, but also the fact that he is pointing out that Monterey is the best port, which will eventually lead to that being the capital of Alta California. So he is saying, hey, it is possible, but beware, there's also all of these native people in this region, and they're numerous, etc. So he also makes numerous observations and accounts of native people along the California coast. But his documents really become the ultimate basis for the exploration and the sacred expedition that is going to take place another 165 years later. So for now, between 1602 and 1769, which is when the first mission is founded in San Diego, essentially what you're going to see is the Spanish do consider Alta California theirs, but they are using it primarily as a necessary stopover and kind of resting spot for the Spanish galleons as they make their way through the Galleon, Manilla Galleon circuit in the Pacific. So no permanent settlements for Alta California will take place for another 165 years after Vizcaino. So here I wanted to kind of just give you guys an overview of the various explorations that were taking place by the Spanish in North America. You can see here, of course, we've got Cabrillo's expedition, Vizcaino's expedition up here, up the coast. But you'll also notice that you have Anote's expedition up here, and that's into New Mexico, over into Kansas. So you have the establishment of Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1610. You also have the establishment of St. Augustine over here in Florida by the Spanish very early on. So all of these expeditions are they're very remote expeditions. They don't usually lead to massive colonizations. Santa Fe will become a colony in 1610, but it will be very sparsely populated. St. Augustine, also a colony for the Spanish, but you can see these various explorations, De Soto's exploration. So they're trying to find good places to colonize, but the problem is that there's just not a lot of interest amongst the Spanish colonizers down here in New Spain to take off and go to these northern remote regions that were difficult to get to, but also could be very dangerous. Also notice here the map, you see Veracruz, Mexico City, Zacatecas I mentioned as being one of the places where the big silver mines were located. You also see Mazatlan here, which was a major launching off point for expeditions to Alta California. San Blas, which we are going to talk about later on, is also located along this coast, which will be a major supply station, a major supply center for Alta California when the colonies are established in this region. You'll also notice over here, of course, these are English settlements that are going to begin to take place starting in 1607. So in 1607, the English are going to establish the colony at Jamestown. So, but you can see that the Spanish really were all over North America prior to the English even having any kind of successful presence here in North America. So why colonize Alta California? Well, I've talked a little bit about it before, but I just wanted to kind of lay it out on one single slide. Number one is to prevent other foreign influence in the region. So you've got the Russians who are coming down the west coast from Alaska, from Siberia, from places like that, and they are engaging in the fur trade, and they are wanting to get more land and outposts. But then you also have the English, right? You've got Sir Francis Drake, who's coming along and claiming New Albanian, for the English crown. Number two is that you have these large native populations, which were noted in all of the early explorers' journals, that could provide a population to colonize and also to make subjects of the Spanish crown. So these new colonists, these new subjects of the crown could provide taxes and tribute and could provide something to the prosperity of the Spanish Empire. And that's kind of part of this last thing, which is that the tribute, the taxes, could be collected from the native population to bolster the coffers of the Spanish crown. Keep in mind that under the Spanish crown, this is not a democracy. This is a monarchy. And everything that came from the colonies, a fifth of any kind of wealth that was generated by the colonies, was required to go back to the Spanish crown, right? It's called the royal fifth. And so the colonies provided a source of revenue and a source of political power, prestige, and influence for the Spanish crown. So they had an interest in expanding their colonies. And eventually it got to the point where they could no longer, if they wanted to claim Alta California, they could no longer ignore it. They would have to establish actual settlements and outposts in that region. Which will eventually lead to the Sacred Expedition in 1769. This Sacred Expedition was a four-pronged expedition. Two expeditions were traveling overland from Baja California into Alta California, and then two sea expeditions were launched. This was all condoned by the Visitor General Jose Galvez, and he commissioned these expeditions specifically for colonizing and establishing a colony. So here they go. They've been thinking about doing this for a long time. They've sent expeditions up and down the coast to map the areas, so they have kind of a pretty good idea of where they want to go. And the first place that they are going to land is San Diego. And this happens on April 11th of 1769 when the ship San Antonio anchors in the San Diego Bay, soon to be joined by the second ship, the San Carlos. As I mentioned, I think it was in my first lecture, maybe my second, when these ships, when the San Antonio anchored in the bay, April 11th, 1769, there was a solar eclipse and an earthquake on the same day. And to the native population, this was a sign of trouble. This was a really bad omen. The two other expeditions were traveling overland, so that was going to take them longer to get there. And these overland expeditions included Father Junipero Serra, who was to head up the missions of the Alta California expedition, and General Gaspar Portola. And he is going to accompany Father Junipero Serra, and he is the one that is going to establish the presidios. So basically you have the presence of the military, the Spanish military, and also, of course, the Catholic Church and the Franciscan order of monks. And the Franciscans had taken over control of the mission system in New Spain from the not Dominicans, Jesuits. I didn't want to stop the recording, but from the Jesuits. I kept thinking Dominican. It's not Dominican, it was the Jesuits. Just a year earlier. So in 1768, the Franciscan order, monastic order, took over the mission system from the Jesuits in New Spain. And so Father Junipero Serra is part of this Franciscan monastic order. So anyway, Serra and Portola eventually reach San Diego by July 1st of 1769. Now, these guys were bummed. They, especially the people that had reached San Diego in April, half about of those sailors actually died, and they died from scurvy. They died because they couldn't find good sources of water. They died like from dysentery. They died because they didn't know how to live off of the land. The native people were very scared of them, so there wasn't a lot of contact or help from the natives initially. So they were really suffering. And July 1st, when the overland expedition gets there, they come across, these suffering, colonists who really hadn't made much progress up until that point. So Junipero Serra says to General Gaspar Portola, he says, go and find this Monterey that Vizcaino had written about, right? Where he's saying this is the ideal port. We need to settle here. And when that happens, when Portola leaves to go on his military expedition to find Monterey, the San Antonio will leave for Mexico to try to resupply the colony. So Portola takes off. He goes up the coast on the San Carlos. The San Antonio returns to Mexico for supplies. And ultimately, only 126 of the original 219, original explorers will survive this initial settling of San Diego. Okay, so here we have, again, artist rendering of Father Junipero Serra over here on the left, and then we see this carved relief of General Portola. So Portola returns actually to San Diego, unsuccessful at finding the Monterey Bay initially. And Junipero Serra, he basically wants to abandon the whole colonization mission. He's talking to Father Serra about this, and Father Serra goes, hold on, let me say some prayers. Let me say the novena, a 9-day long prayer, essentially. And if our supply ship has not returned by then that will be a sign from God that we need to abort this mission. And so, of course, Portola says, okay, fine, Father, go ahead, say your prayer. And remarkably, on the 9th day of Father Serra reciting the novena, the supply ship emerges on the horizon. And this is March 21st of 1770. And the colony is saved, and they decide to stay, and they make another trip up north to look for Monterey and are successful, and eventually the second mission in Monterey will be established. So here is a link to a video about the founding of the first missions in Alta California. It talks about both the expedition up, to San Diego. It talks about some of the trials of the expedition, but it also talks about a little bit about the founding of the missions and the first mission Indians. So I recommend clicking on this link. It is not required, but again, it is good supplemental contextual material for the lecture. Okay, so the first missions established in this mission system that will emerge in Alta California is, of course, Mission San Diego, which was established in July of 1769. And at that point, it was extremely rudimentary, right? You've got, the mission bells, you've got a cross erected, and then you probably have a very rudimentary shack. Really, what they wanted was to get the native people to come to the location and get them to work to build the missions, which is eventually what happens. And that also happens in Mission San Carlos Borromeo, which is up in, originally founded in Monterey, what is now present day Monterey, but the location was moved by Father Serra to the other side of the peninsula, what is now Carmel, in June of 1770. So you can see here, this is a historic, it's actually from a postcard of the mission later on. So Mission San Carlos will become the headquarters of the Franciscan Order in Alta California. It will also become the primary residence of Junipero Serra for the rest of his life. This is also where he dies and where his final resting place is. So Junipero Serra is the first head of the mission system in California. In his tenure as in that role, he will found 9 missions. Eventually, there will be 21 missions founded throughout California, mentioned already. Okay. So now we're going to talk about something that your textbook also talks about, which is gente de razón, or men of reason. It's important to understand when you think of Spanish colonial culture in the New World that there is really this two-tiered class system. There is a very multi-tiered racial and ethnic system that emerges in Spanish, in the Spanish New World. But for classes, there's really 2 classes of people. The men of reason, or the gente de razón, or the gente sin razón, which is the men without reason. So who are these men of reason? Well, these men of reason were the people in the Spanish colonies that were considered superior and more fit to rule. In other words, they are the sophisticated ones. They are the ones that understand civilization. They have an understanding of utilizing the world and the natural resources in a very sort of European kind of way, and a European sensibilities to them. So the men of reason included, of course, the padres, right? Anybody associated with the church and the church hierarchy certainly would have been men of reasons. Any of the Spaniards, so any of the people that were either born in Spain, or maybe they were a Creole and they had come over from Spain, their fathers or parents had come from Spain and married into indigenous populations. And then finally the Californios, right? And the Californios were, again, part of this colonial culture, in that you would have to have had at least one parent that was descended from the colonists, right? So you could have had a mulatto parent that had come over from New Spain to Alta California. They were half Spanish and they were half African American, and then they would essentially be considered mulatto. So there were mulattoes who were Californios, there were mestizo who were Californios, so they were a mix of Spanish and indigenous population. There were Californios who were a mix of the Spanish and the California Indians, right? And we're going to talk about how a lot of the original Spaniards who came to Alta California ended up marrying into the indigenous population. That was also true in some cases for some of the foreigners that came as well. So the Californios were considered part of this elite class of men of reason. Who were the men without reason? Well, very simply put, the men without reason were the Indians. They were the Native American population. They were considered inferior, uncivilized, and incapable of self-rule. Keep in mind, however, in Alta California, the majority of the population would have been this class of men without reason. By 1800, as you can see from the slide, the Spanish-speaking population of Alta California was only about 550 people in about 100 separate families. So you have a very small population of these people that would have been considered men of reason, where the majority of the population would have been men without reason. Now, even if a Native American converted to Catholicism, that would be the only thing that they would be that they would have access to. So that would elevate their status if they converted to Catholicism, but they still would not be seen as fit to rule. So they could not ever jump from their class of, men without reason to the class of men with reason. Okay, so I know we've already talked about the mission system, but we've talked about the mission system within the context of the native people of the missions, right? The mission Indians who essentially built the missions and ran the missions and were the ones that provided the labor force for the mission system. But during the Spanish period of California history, the missions are really the most important institution. They provide the basis of the economy. They also provide the basis of Spanish culture in California. There was 21 of them altogether, beginning in San Diego in the south, and then ultimately ending with Solano in the north, which is just a little bit north of San Francisco. They were located 1 day's walk apart along the coast, so they're mostly located in the coastal areas. And by walk, we're really talking about like horseback ride apart. And the presidios, which kind of accompanied the missionization system, were forts in California that were filled with soldiers whose primary purpose, at least at first, was to protect the missions, and then later on also, of course, to protect the pueblos, the towns. They were built with a specific purpose in mind. One was, of course, to convert the Native American population to Christianity and essentially acculturate them into Spanish society. And the second was to create an industrious population and an economy that could form the basis of this colony in Alta California for the Spanish. Father Junipero Serra will be the first head of the mission system in California, and he eventually founds 9 missions before he dies. And Father Fermin Francisco de Lasson will found all of the rest except for the last one before he dies. And the last one was built in 1823. So interestingly, the last mission built in 1823, which was the Solano mission, was built after Mexican independence. So, you can see how this system, even though the Mexican government was really moving towards secularization of the missions, the mission system still was very much ensconced in the cultures and traditions of Alta California. So let's look at a map here of the location of the various missions in California. And you can see here, so connecting the missions was a trail that was called the King's Road or the El Camino Real. And it connected all of these missions together. So you see, you have the San Diego mission, you have the San Luis Rey mission, San Juan Capistrano, San Gabriel mission, Fernando Mission, San Buenaventura, Santa Barbara, Santa Ynez, La Purisma, San Luis Obispo, San Miguel, San Antonio, Soledad, Carmel or Los Carlos Bormelo de Carmel, Santa Cruz Mission, San Juan Bautista, Santa Clara, San Jose, San Francisco, San Rafael, and eventually Solano. And you can see here next to each of these mission names, you can see the dates that they were founded. So the San Diego mission, of course, and the Carmel mission were the first two, and I talked about those already. San Diego in 1769 and Carmel in 1770. As I mentioned, they were designed to be about a day's travel apart, some of them more than others. And again, they were created to create this structure, this economic and cultural background structure to this early Spanish colony. So now we're just going to look at some images from the mission system, some of them from daily life of the missions. And of course, many of these images have Native Americans in them because, as I mentioned, they are the primary labor force in the missions. Think of the missions as really kind of being their own like industry. You know, they were places of production, right? Where the whole purpose was to produce food and also goods that the church could then sell and to get a profit and also, of course, to live and to exist. So here we have an image of Native Americans using a plow for a field of the planting near Mission San Diego. Here we have an ox cart that was very common to haul, heavy goods throughout the mission system. Here we have an image of a father giving a music class to a group of Native Americans. All of the church services were done on the floor. So if you've ever been to a California mission and they've been rebuilt and recreated and all of that, you'll go into the chapel of the mission, and oftentimes there will be pews, seats where people sit, and that was not the case back in the early mission system. Everybody sat on the floor, and and especially the native people, they were just there essentially to learn the catechisms and get basic instruction, and they were pretty accustomed to being on the ground, and so there wasn't even any thought in creating seats and pews for people to sit during services. So Native American women, of course, provided a lot of the labor as well in the mission system. Women cooked, they did the laundering, they wove and made the mats, were weaving and to make the cloth for the clothing. Here you have the metate, or the mealing stone, where the woman is crushing the corn that again would have been cultivated on the mission grounds for tortillas. So, of course, ranching is going to become more and more popular as time goes on in California, but in the missions, those were big working ranches essentially, and so you had cattle, you had sheep, and pretty soon the colonial population gets involved with this as well. And we're going to see this more as we get into the Mexican period. But the California method of killing cattle on the ranch becomes legendary because the Californios, especially in all of the ranchers and people who worked on the ranches, the caballeros, the cowboys, become legendary throughout New Spain for having a really powerful and deep relationship with horses, and also their abilities to be able to lasso and take down animals. So you can see this is, a very sort of sophisticated technique here of lassoing a cattle. You can see that one of the cowboys has the cattle by the neck and the other by the hind legs, and then a third is going in to slaughter them. And, there was plenty of cattle, so, the population really there was never a meat shortage in early California. But the meat itself, could only be stored for a certain period of time. It had to either be salted or dried in order to be preserved. Typically, the reasons why cattle were slaughtered was for their hides and for their fat. And the fat was used in candle making, and the hides were used to make saddles and other leather goods. They were also used as trading commodities. And this becomes more and more common as more and more foreigners are going to visit the shores of California. So another major thing about California, as we all know, is water is a really big deal. California, in most parts of California, experience periodic droughts. And in order for water to, sustain a population in California, and especially in Southern California, you need to have water diversion systems. And in this case, you can see one of the oldest water diversion systems, evidence of one of the oldest water diversion systems in California that was used at the La Purisma mission. So these stone zanjas, or what we call aqueducts, were built throughout the mission systems and also throughout the pueblos, again, to divert water. And this water would have been used for irrigation. It would have been used for drinking. It might have even been used to water the herds of animals. So, but again, it was really essential for these streams, rivers, lakes, to have this, to be diverted so that the water could be brought to these population centers. Okay, so as I already mentioned, of course, the missions are going to form the basis of the Spanish colony, the Spanish era of California. They're the basis of the economy. And so the missions would trade their goods, and they had corn, wheat, beans, and barley. They also, of course, had herds of cattle. They had bulls that they could sell. They had pigs. They had oxen, sheep. They had hemp that they would use to make ropes. And then they would have sea otters that Native Americans primarily would go out and help hunt for the mission systems. And they could use that to sell or trade for goods as traders stopped along the coast of California. And these might be fellow Spanish traders, so they might be Spanish galleons. Maybe the galleons were returning from Asia, and so they would trade for goods in Alta California. But it also could be other foreigners, and this was actually technically illegal. See, anybody under the Spanish crown was supposed to only trade with other Spaniards. It was illegal for people under the Spanish crown to trade with the English or to trade with the Dutch, to trade with the French, to trade with the Russians. That was all technically illegal. However, because California was such a remote outpost, this type of trade happened frequently, and it started to happen more and more frequently as the Spanish period went on. And the simple reason for that was because of the fact that it was opportunity, and so people saw an opportunity and they took it. There were also regular supply ships from Mexico from San Blas, Mexico, along the coast of like where Acapulco, Mazatlan is. These supply routes would be taken out from there, and they again would resupply the colonies, the missions, and then they would, in exchange, get these goods, which they would bring back to mainland Mexico. Okay, so let's just kind of quickly summarize the California mission system here. So 65 years, the California mission system existed. During that time, 79,000 approximately California Indians were baptized. And the Padres have very detailed records, so we know we have a pretty good idea of the numbers here. The most prosperous and populous missions in California were certainly in Southern California. And I think this was also a function of the populations prior to contact. The Southern California tribes had huge populations and huge population centers compared to the Northern California tribes. During that time, more than half of the native population is going to die. So again, we're talking conservative numbers here, but we're talking about 300,000 at contact, 150,000 at the end of this mission period. The mission system, of course, is going to contribute greatly to the founding of the ranching system and the agricultural economy of California. And this is something that still exists to this day, right? We still are very much an agricultural state, even though we have these big population centers like San Francisco and Los Angeles. Agriculture is one of our biggest export commodities here in the state of California. So if you'd like, you can link to this video about the California missions. It is an hour-long video, an hour plus long, but I'm just recommending that you fast forward to minute 6:20 and then watch to about 10:44. This is the time period. This is the part in the video where they talk about the California mission system and the Spanish missions. And so I recommend watching it. Again, it's not required. If you have time, watch the entire episode. This is a great episode of a series called Latino Americans. And it talks about the contributions of Latinx people throughout the history of the West and America generally. But of course, in these early videos, it's focusing on Spanish colonization. So I recommend watching the whole thing, but it is long. So if you don't have time to watch the whole thing, then go ahead and just fast forward to 6 minutes, 20 seconds, and then watch until 10 minutes, 44 seconds. Okay, so as I mentioned before, and again, I'll be kind of brief about this section because this is more just for your information and just kind of to get a sense of how this structure begins to build up. So you've got the presidios, right? And altogether there will be 4 presidios built in Spanish California. One in San Diego, one in Santa Barbara, one in Monterey, and one in San Francisco. So they're kind of equally spaced apart so that those presidios, those soldiers could theoretically protect all of the surrounding areas. Their whole purpose was for protection. The presidios were also a source of population for California. So if you were a Spanish soldier and you got sent to Alta California, you were sent to a presidio. Once your term of service was over, you would be relieved of your duties, and then you might choose to stay in California, and then you would eventually move to a pueblo. And so the pueblos were built for civilians, right? So they were built for, former soldiers of the presidio, retiring soldiers of the presidio. They were also built for potential colonists. So If people wanted to come to Alta California from New Spain, they could do that, and they could settle in one of these pueblos, and they would be able to get a small parcel of land in the pueblo. This is an actual photograph of the Los Angeles Pueblo in the late 1800s. So Los Angeles was one of the first pueblos founded in California. So again, the purpose of the pueblos was to expand the presence of Spain in Alta California, and to encourage settlement into Alta California. There were three primary pueblos that were built and had an actual government during the Spanish period. Those are San Jose, Los Angeles, and Santa Cruz. So the first is San Jose, founded in 1777, and this was by 15 settlers from the presidios of San Francisco and Monterey. So these would have been primarily former soldiers, and they were, they had retired and they didn't want to go back to New Spain, to Mexico, and so they decided to settle in Alta California. And each of them would have been given a plot of land, and they would start to found the actual town by creating institution or businesses and things like that in the town. These were very small towns at first, right? I mean, you're talking 15 settlers in 1777, and they were very slow to grow as well. The second major Spanish pueblo was that of Los Angeles. As you can see, the original name of Los Angeles was quite long. La Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Angeles del Rio del Porciúncula. And so that's what we're just going to call Los Angeles, founded in 1781. By 46 colonists from Sinaloa in Mexico. So you had this expedition of colonists that made an expedition up from Mexico and decided to found this particular town. Most of them were mestizo and mulatto. So again, going back to this idea that California has always been a very, very diverse region, and it was founded by diverse people. And it, again, going even back further to Native people, you had diverse Native people prior to contact. And then Villa de Branciforte, this is what we now call Santa Cruz, founded in 1797 by a few ranchers and former convicts. So this was another thing that happened, as sometimes the Spanish government would send convicts to the colony. This is similar to what happened in the British colonies as well. They would send former convicts to the colonies as a way to kind of exile them, get rid of them, but also to encourage settlement in these colonies. So the pueblos were supplied by supply ships that regularly sailed from San Blas. So as I mentioned before, this town along the western coast of Mexico would take these supply ships up to Alta California, and they would trade with the pueblos, they would trade with the missions. They were their primary lifeline, really, to greater New Spain. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to talking about gender relationships in early California and Spanish California, and specifically women. Spanish California was an extremely patriarchal society. Women were expected to be obedient wives. They were expected to be virgins upon marriage, so absolutely no premarital sex for women. Women typically got married between the ages of 15 and 20. If you weren't married by the time you were 20, then, maybe there was something wrong with you. And the sexual mores, the sort of sexual guidelines, or what was acceptable for women and men, were completely different, right? So for women, all of your sexuality was to be confined to marriage, but for men, it was very common for men to have extramarital relationships. There were lots of children who were born out of wedlock, and they were considered illegitimate children because they didn't have a legitimate name, nor did they have any right of inheritance. This particular cultural norm was really difficult for Native women. Keep in mind that in Native society, Native women sometimes became chiefs. Native women were highly respected and in the form of healers. Sometimes Native women in certain tribes would have multiple husbands. Sometimes it was okay in certain tribal communities for women to have extramarital relationships or even premarital sex. So these types of sexual mores and expectations of Spanish society were particularly harsh on Native American women. Native American women also were expected to uphold these ideals, right? And there were punishments for women that didn't do this. And we see this especially in the mission system. During the Spanish period, there was about a 15% intermarriage rate between Spanish men and indigenous women. So you see that there are lots of children that are being born from these unions in early California. And so, you might have a father who is a Spanish soldier and a mother who is a California Indian woman. And because of this, you have this real sort of blending of these two cultures. Native women were also many times the targets of sexual exploitation and violence. And they definitely were the victims of rape in many cases. You could even say that in some of the cases of intermarriage, that was probably forced in some cases. And so the Native women who were very knowledgeable in plants and herbology, and they knew the sort of local plant world, they found ways to try to fight against and resist the sexual oppression that was brought on by the Spanish. So one of the ways that Native women would do this is through abortion, and we know that that was something that happened because if somebody got caught, there was very stiff punishments, and those typically were documented. Other ways that Native women could resist is, let's say, for example, you were one of these women who was forced into marrying a Spanish man and you had children. You could continue your cultural traditions through your children, right? Maybe when your husband wasn't around, you spoke to them in your native tongue, or maybe you carried on some oral histories or some oral traditions. So there certainly were ways of resisting, surviving, thriving. As I've mentioned, that's what the human spirit does, right? But it was very difficult, I would say, particularly for women, Native women in this society. And then finally, if you were one of the women who were married to one of the men of reason class, right? So if you were married to one of these Californios, or if you were married to a Spaniard, you could inherit property. And this is something that is very different than English colonial society, for example, where women absolutely had no right of property inheritance. Everything went to male heirs. And so this made Spanish society kind of unique, and there are actually some really interesting examples of women in Spanish and Mexican California society that end up inheriting these vast tracts of land, and they own these massive ranchos, and they actually make quite a bit of money, and they become very powerful in their own right. This is also important for us in modern times in California, because when California became part of the United States, this right of property inheritance for women carried over into the American period. And so the community property rights that married women now enjoy in California is a remnant and a carryover from this Spanish period. So although there was a lot of oppression, and certainly it was a very strongly patriarchal society, in some cases, women were able to accumulate wealth because of this right to inherit property. So now just a quick overview of Spanish Californian culture. And this culture is really going to carry over also into the Mexican period. So Spanish California culture was certainly heavily influenced by indigenous traditions. We know, for example, that some of the mission Indians, once the Padres, and again, it depended upon the Padre, realized that by allowing indigenous people to continue their rituals and rites of passage, some of their rites of passage and things like that, that they would be more peaceful and less likely to rise up and resist. And so because of that, you start to see some of this integration of community and dancing and singing and some of these things that also are going to kind of blend into this very sort of uniquely Californian culture. Certainly family and religion were very important. The Californians, they had very large families. Of course, mortality rates were relatively high compared to nowadays. So that was one reason why people had a lot of kids, is maybe not all of your kids would live to adulthood. But it was also encouraged, right, to have these very, very large families. And religion, of course, was very important because, when you think about, the founding of Spanish California, it's really about the mission systems, and the missions really become sort of the cultural center of celebrations. So you have, births of being celebrated through baptismals at the missions. You have marriages, being celebrated at the missions. And then, in the last final rites and funerals held at the missions. And so that, all of these major rites of passage in one's life would have been done at the mission. And so it really does become the center of culture. And so as an extension of that, religion becomes very important. Hospitality was a very important custom in early California. In fact, in many cases, it was a matter of survival, life or death, right? So it was very common for travelers throughout California, and this was noted many times in foreigners who would come to visit the state, and they would travel through the state, through Spanish or even Mexican California. And they noted that the people were particularly friendly and open, and that you could literally walk up to a stranger's home, knock on the door, be invited in, be offered, some drink and some food. And so hospitality and this kindness to strangers was sort of a foundational feature of California culture. Sexual impropriety, okay, so in other words, people going outside of marriage, so extramarital affairs, appears to be an ongoing issue in California history. So there was a lot of hanky-panky, so to speak, like going around in early California, and we know that, very prominent people even engaged in a lot of these extramarital affairs that took place throughout the region. And then finally, the first public school in California opened in 1800 in San Jose, but illiteracy remained very, very high. So people in California, many of them just didn't know how to read. And it wasn't necessarily because they couldn't, it was just because you didn't have to know. Society was very simple, it was very rural, and the things that were important was, things like knowing how to, live off of the land, knowing how to ride a horse, knowing how to navigate the particular cultural norms. And those were the things that were important in this very rural agrarian society of early California. And reading just wasn't one of those things that was high on the priority for a lot of people. So one of the biggest parts of California culture, again, noted by a lot of travelers, was the dancing, the celebration, the fandangos, as they called them, that would happen on a regular basis in California. Every day was accompanied by a siesta in the middle of the day, so people didn't work overly hard. Californians were noted for constantly wanting to come up for a reason to party. So there were a lot of, saints' days that were celebrated. Many festivals and holidays that were held, big family get-togethers where dancing and music and things like that were highlighted. So yes, and we know this is again extensively written about throughout the eyewitness accounts by early travelers in California. Californians were also known for their horsemanship, as I've already mentioned. People would say, Californians were basically could ride a horse before they could walk. People would put their babies up on horses so that they could get used to the feel of being in a saddle. It was very much part of the culture of California. So here we have again the ranching and the lassoing. Californians became very well known for their abilities to lasso, cattle and other animals. And then here we have one of the favorite pastimes of some of these early Californians was to go out and lasso a bear, of which there were some back then, right? And we're going to talk about the last bear in California, which was killed in 1922. So here again is an artist rendering of Spanish Californian life, and you'll notice the sort of elaborate clothing of the Californians. This is also something that was noted by a lot of people traveling through California. Spanish Mexican California was the clothing. The people were very prideful and really took a lot of care in their appearances. And they had access to all of these luxury goods because of the fact that the merchant ships coming from Asia would, stop over in California. So they would have access to these, very fine materials and silks and things like that. And so you get these beautiful dresses by the Californianos that are made, and just some very fancy, suits made for the men as well. So again, all of these things were extensively written about as we get into the late 1800s, and that's the American period, but we have photographic evidence of these families and the way that they dressed and the way that they looked. So this artist rendering is not very far off of what we could imagine it would have looked like. Okay, so one of the biggest sort of sources of revenue, right, for Alta California in the Spanish period was the fur trade. And we're going to see that change to the cattle and tallow trade when we get to the Mexican period. But in this early period, the Spanish period, and by the Spanish period, we're talking 1769 until 1821. Okay, so 1769 to 1821 was this fur trade. And by fur, we're talking about otter and seal skins. This is the fur that was highly desirable, by people throughout the world. And of course, the coasts of California are full of sea lions and seals and otters. The waters are just filled with them at the time. And so In 1796, the first American vessel, aptly named the Otter, anchored in California. And what they're doing is they're, of course, harvesting these otters and taking their skins. The Californians also engaged in this, and I talked about this when I talked about the missions, right? So the missions also kind of had their own hand in this industry. But for a large bit of this industry, it's the foreigners that are engaging in it, right? So you've got the American foreigners, you've got the Russian foreigners, you've got Hawaiians that are coming over, you've got Australians that are coming over as well. But the Americans and the Russians were probably the two biggest ones engaging in this trans-Pacific fur trade. So 1796 is the first American vessel. 1804 is the first Russian company to establish trade between the Americans. So the Russian-American Company, or sometimes also referred to as the RAC, was established in Sitka, Alaska. And these two countries are working together to try to harvest the waters of the west coast of the United States, which of course includes California. And these Pacific trade routes included, Hawaii, Canton, China, and of course California. So California becomes part of this bigger trans-Pacific trading network. Again, just adding to the international aspect of the state. Your textbook talks about Nikolai Rezanov and Concepcion Arguello, and so I'm just going to mention them really quick. So Rezanov was a captain of one of these AC or RAC company boats, and they ended up having to stop in the San Francisco Bay, and Concepcion and Arguello was the daughter of the Comandante of the San Francisco Presidio. She was famously, very beautiful, and she was about 15 years old. Well, the legend goes that they fell in love, right? This Russian and this Californio girl, and he leaves San Francisco to go and ask the Tsar for Arguello's hand in marriage, and he ends up dying on the passage back, and she remains very chaste throughout the rest of her life. She eventually becomes a nun, and she just waits for him, to return. So it's like this tragic love story. But the interesting thing about it is that it becomes very much part of California lore, right? There's certain things about California. I mean, obviously, its history and its connection to Spanish colonization and its role as a Mexican province makes it unique within the context of greater American history. But there's also these little stories that get woven into the story of California through oral histories being passed down, also music and song that gets passed down over time. And this tragic love story between Nikolai Rezanov and Concepcion Arguello is definitely one of those stories of California lore. The second big story of California when it comes to these sort of unique stories that get passed on and also get celebrated in song and things like that is Hippolyte de Boucard and his pirate raids along the California coast. So Hippolyte Boucard is a French-Argentine pirate. He was born in France. He moves to Argentina as a young man, and he gets very much caught up in this fight for independence from Spain. All of the Napoleonic Wars of the early 1800s really destabilizes Spain's colonial possessions in the Americas, and particularly South America, Mexico. And so there's all of these fights for independence in these countries, and that was also happening in Argentina. And so Hippolyte decides that he's going to take advantage of this kind of chaotic, political situation, and he's going to go on all of these pirating raids. And he targets California specifically because California was one of those provinces that, at least initially, did not support independence from Spain. And I think a lot of that had to do with the mission system. California's connection to the mission system and its connection to Mexico City via the mission system was so integral in their culture and part of their founding and establishment that there was a lot of resistance, at least at first, in California for independence from Spain. And so Hippolyte decides that he is going to target California. So he takes this hugely international crew on this boat, and they travel across the Pacific. They go to the Philippines, they go to Hawaii, and eventually they reach the shores of California, where they set their sights on Monterey, which is, of course, the capital of Spanish California. And so they sail into the Monterey harbor, and they very boldly, jump off the ship, and they just start, raiding and pilfering, and eventually the inhabitants, or the people that were left in Monterey, because many of them had left because people knew he was coming, end up fleeing. And Hippolyte, very proudly, sort of hoists the Argentinian flag above Monterey, and, takes down the Spanish flag, and then he, raids all of the storage lockers and burns a bunch of the public buildings, etc., and then leaves, and makes his way down the coast, where he and his crew disembark again at Santa Barbara and San Juan Capistrano, and again, very similar stories there, raiding, pillaging, eventually raising the Argentinian flag and then moving on. So it was much more of like sort of a symbolic gesture, because obviously once he was gone, here in come the Spanish authorities again, and they take down the Argentinian flag and they raise back up the Spanish flag, and then they get to work, sort of rebuilding. I think, though, for the inhabitants of California, one of the interesting things about the Hippolyte raids, pirate raids, is that it really, I think, for people that were very isolated from what was happening in this broader context of the Mexican Revolution for Independence and these Latin American revolutions for independence, it opened people's minds and eyes to what was happening globally, internationally. And for some of the Californios and others who were in these more elite positions, they start to think, maybe not supporting, Mexican independence is not a good thing. Maybe we want to kind of rethink that. And so we're going to start to see some Californios as we're moving into the Mexican period of California history. We're going to see some Californios going, man, I think that maybe it's better that, that Mexico gains its independence from Spain. And those will be some of the same people that will eventually say, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to be part of the United States. But of course, we will cross that bridge when we get there. So here we go with the summary slide of this very long lecture. So let's go ahead and summarize the period of Spanish colonial history in California. 60 years of Spanish rule altogether. And the Spanish culture, of course, made a significant imprint on California. Not only is the natural environment going to be impacted through the introduction of non-native plants and non-native animals, but you are also going to have, of course, the built environment. So you've got roads that are being built by the Spanish. You've, of course, got the buildings that are being built, the pueblos, the missions, etc. The language and the naming of places heavily influenced by the Spanish, right? Today, we call the Cahuilla band Agua Caliente, which is a Spanish word for the band of Indians that lived around Palm Springs, because when the Spanish came through the Coachella Valley in 1775, they noted that the native people in the Palm Springs area all, utilized the hot springs in that area. And so they called that band of Cahuilla Indian the Agua Caliente. We still call them the Agua Caliente band of Indians, right? So again, that's one example of how Spanish language has really shaped the naming of places and people throughout California. And then finally, laws, right? The laws of the Spanish and later Mexican government are really going to heavily influence the laws of early American California, as we're going to see some of those laws roll over. And I mentioned the communal property rights, or the rights of inheritance of property for women. That's one example of those kinds of laws that are going to roll over into the American period. Native American culture is going to contribute significantly to California's culture. And we really, I don't think, even really understand all of the ways that that is, because Native people in California became so enmeshed in the Spanish society through intermarriage and other ways that it's difficult to distinguish. By the time we get to the end of the Spanish period and the Mexican period, it's very difficult to distinguish, well, what is Spanish and what is Native American. Some of those cultural lines have been blurred and blended. And then finally, California is, of course, part of this larger Pacific economy, so that not only do we have the influence of Native Americans, but you are also getting the influence of people from all over the world. You've got Americans, of course, you've got Europeans, you've got Hawaiians, you've got Russians, you've got the English, you've got the Dutch, you've got the Chinese, you've got the Japanese, you've got this huge influence of the Pacific world that is going to be very much tied to California. And so our next lecture is going to be about the Mexican period of California, which we are going to see last from 1821 until 1848. So we're going to talk about what California is like after Mexican independence. We're going to show how foreigners will begin to show more and more of an increasing interest in California's land and resources, and how ultimately a lot of the internal political divisions within this northern province of Mexico, California, how it will ultimately make it vulnerable. And of course, the ultimate end of the Spanish and Mexican period of California history will be the Mexican-American War. So we will talk about that in next week, and have a good weekend. Let me know if you have any questions. All right, thanks.